Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this lesson on the Federalist and the Anti-Federalists. I am Miss Jennifer Blank. See, hi, how are you? And I'm very excited to be sharing this information with you. So hold on to your hats, and here we go. Before we get officially started on all of our content, I want to just go over a couple of key ideas with you. I want everyone to remember that we had the Revolutionary War where we officially separated from Great Britain. And once we did that and became our own country, we needed a system of government, some way to govern ourselves. And that took the shape of the Articles of Confederation. So we won the war, and then we created the system of government called the Articles of Confederation. That wasn't working out too well, so we had to change some things. So the Continental Congress came together, and eventually we had a Constitutional Convention because it was decided that the Articles of Confederation were not quite good enough. So we had this big debate over what new system of government we should create. And it's at this point that the Federalists and Anti-Federalists start to show up, right here in the Constitutional Convention and during the ratification debate. Those are the things that we're going to focus on here, and we're going to talk about the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. And once we moved from the ratification debate, we did end up approving the Constitution, and of course that was in existence from 1787 all the way up until right now. Before I go any further talking about the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, I need to remind my students of this very, very, very important fact. We are not a democracy, okay? See right there? We are not a democracy. Ooh, yes, we are not a democracy. Our founders were not fans of democracy. And I want to draw your attention to this quote here from Mr. James Madison. All right, here's where we are. Democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and in general have been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. Basically, that means that democracy is a disaster. It doesn't work out, and it's very short, and it usually ends very violently. Our founders worried about the majority making all the decisions. So instead of creating a democracy, they instead created a republic. And Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution says just that. The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government. And then over here, Captain Picard, I don't know, those of you Trekkies out there might recognize him. Why do they keep calling it a democracy when we're a constitutional republic? That is a system of government that we ended up creating, okay? And I'm going to talk about just how we arrived at that conclusion. We didn't start out as a republic. We started out as something a little different, and I'll talk about that in a second. Okay, in front of you, you see this lovely little graphic here that I found online. It's called Comparing Governments. And a unitary system of government is one method of governing. It's where the central government is superior. A central government has all the power to the subunits, okay? All the power comes from the central government. Our founders just fought off a tyrannical, horrible central government. So they definitely didn't pick this one. That one was out. They didn't want to do that. And so we ended up creating a confederal government. And if you watch my lesson on the Articles of Confederation, you'll understand exactly what that is in more detail. That's what we started. That was the A of C, right? The Articles of Confederation. But as you learned about in that lesson, we had some problems. The articles weren't really getting the job done, so we had to modify what we were doing. And when we came together for the Constitutional Convention, our founders decided on a federal system of government. And as you can see, there are arrows going back and forth, right? So the central government and the state governments, or the subunits, they share power. Power is shared. Power is divided. So that's very, very important. And let me talk about who the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists were and how they arrived at the conclusion of a federal government being the way to go. Before I talk about each separately, I want to give you a big picture overview of the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. So you see here, these are all the positions of the Federalists, and these are all the positions of the Anti-Federalists. So the Federalists were in favor of the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists were against. The Federalists wanted to ditch the Articles of Confederation, and the Anti-Federalists wanted to just fix them. Power of the states, the Federalists said, no, the states have too much power, we need a stronger central government, and the Anti-Federalists said, no. We don't need a central government. States should have the most power. That's the way it should be. The Bill of Rights, the Federalists really didn't see any need. They didn't think it was necessary. But the Anti-Federalists said that if you don't put this in, the government is going to abuse its power, so the Bill of Rights is necessary. It's got to be there. The Anti-Federalists thought that a small republic was best when the Federalists favored a large. And the majority of the Federalists were wealthy, but there were some common citizens also. Of the Anti-Federalists, they were small farmers. So that's your big picture overview of the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. Okay, so I'm going to start out with the Federalists. The Federalists wanted a strong central government, okay? They wanted to make sure that the national government had additional powers so they could effectively handle national issues, okay? They wanted to divide the powers among different branches of government, and they proposed just one person to lead the executive branch, okay? There were a couple of very important Federalists. John Jay was one, and one of the things that James Madison wanted to point out, he was another Federalist, and I'm going to bring this quote up here. He said, "The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in state governments are numerous and infinite." So the Federalists, even though they wanted the central government to have more power, they still wanted to make sure that the state governments had the necessary power in order to keep the federal government in check. Anti-Federalists, by contrast, were very skeptical. They were very suspicious of centralized government, of a national government having too much power. They loved the Articles of Confederation. They thought the Articles of Confederation were good times. C equals A of C. All right, the Articles of Confederation were awesome. They were good times, okay? So they wanted to make sure that power remained with the states, and they wanted the legislative branch, the people's branch, to have more power. They were very worried that a strong president or executive would become just like King George, who we just fought a war against. So they were very concerned about that. And they believed that this thing called a Bill of Rights was necessary in order to preserve those rights. And I talk about the Bill of Rights in another lesson. But the key difference between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists was that the Anti-Federalists thought that centralized government was dangerous, and the Federalists thought that centralized government was necessary. The ratification debate was intense. We take for granted now, I think, that our Constitution is just there and it's always been there, but it was a very hard-fought battle. And the folks who were at the forefront of this battle were the Federalists, namely Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. Those three guys, three of our esteemed founding fathers, wrote the Federalist Papers, and these were papers written to convince America to ratify or approve the Constitution. Now, there are two really, really important Federalist Papers you should pay attention to. One is Federalist number 10, and it discussed the problem of faction and how our system of government would deal with it effectively. And then Federalist 51 talked about the separation of powers and checks and balances that we find in our government, and it talked about how that was necessary for self-government to work. I strongly suggest that all of you ask your teachers about these two documents in class. I'm going to discuss it in detail with my students. All right, so this is kind of a dumb question, who won? We know who won. We know that it was the Constitution. The Federalists won, and we now have the Constitution of the United States of America, but the Anti-Federalists won too, because they did get the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and they were added in order to convince the Anti-Federalists to sign on. If you want to know more about the Bill of Rights, check out my Know Me a lesson on that. And until then, I will see you next time.